So you may be wondering what's going on legally under these COVID restrictions. So let's just have a brief overview of the powers that are being used at the moment by governments to restrict your freedoms and rights. So whenever government restricts your freedoms and rights, let's just be clear here, it should always be proportionate, for a proper purpose, and for a particular time. And those things need to be communicated very clearly to the community. And so these rights and freedoms that are encroached upon or taken away from you, such as freedom of movement, freedom of association, you can't move about freely, you can't meet with, your organizations as you usually do, they can only be proportionately for a time and for a proper purpose. Now, the situation we find ourselves in is that Parliament has decided that public health is more important and trumps your individual freedoms and rights. Whenever we look at freedoms and rights, we look at which one is more important or should take precedent over the other. Now, although the Biosecurity Act is clear in section 60 and 61 that only a court can order through a particular order on the individual the restraint on their movement and association, for example, to self-isolate, to wear a mask, to, be in lockdown, these court orders should be in place. But for the fact that the state governments under the Emergency Act have taken upon themselves to declare an state of emergency in the state. So under the Emergency Act, it is clear that in order for this legislation to be in power, it needs to be justified. You need to prove the emergency. And in fact, it needs to be proven every 14 days. So every 14 days, it needs to be renewed, and a reason as to why it needs to be renewed given. Because remember, they're encroaching upon individual freedoms and rights for the purpose of public health. So this needs to be proven by evidence. Now, this is a matter we need to look into. Has this been proven, and to what extent? And is there sufficient evidence for it? This is all part of the checks and balances of a constitutional democracy. And as citizens, it is our right to ask these questions and engage on these matters very actively. So we also have these apps. And these apps are in actual violation of the Privacy Act, Section 94H, in fact, of the Privacy Act. So even though that there is a breach there, again, because the state has declared a state of emergency, this power trumps our privacy. So can you see that when there is a conflicting law, there needs to be debate and inquiry as to which law takes precedent or which right or freedom should be given rise to in whatever circumstance, given the facts. So you may be asking, what about our international human rights charters and declarations? For example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights. These are important mechanisms because they give us a framework. Internationally, we've agreed that these should be the standards. There should be freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom of religion. There should never be an encroachment upon your right to choose, for example, medical procedures, your right to choose particular services one over the other, your right to choose where you live, and your freedom of movement should not be encroached upon. Now, although these international laws do exist, and they are relevant to a certain extent in Australia, if they have not been introduced into our domestic legislation, then it is hard to rely on them as law themselves. This is because we live in a common law system. Now, Victoria and ACT have a Human Rights Act, and it's applicable just to that jurisdiction. And these human rights acts, or in Victoria's case, Human Rights Charter, reflect on these international laws and precedents set by these charters and declarations. Now, they have power insofar as the jurisdiction and again, the proportionality to which they can be exercised given the facts. So for example, the freedom of movement for businesses to engage and enter into trade and commerce across the borders has been encroached upon. And, businesses cannot continue, for example, under lockdown. And this is a restriction that the government's placed on businesses for the reason that they believe there is an imminent health threat that supersedes the rights of business people to engage in commerce and trade, to, have customers, to go on with their everyday, economic life. Now, that is in violation of Section 91 of the Constitution, but again, these matters are justified in relation to proportionality. So, if the states have deemed that there is a public health threat, that this takes precedent over those rights and freedoms. Now, these matters to date have not been tested in the courts. So it is incumbent upon the courts to test these laws and theories. And of course, for that to occur, we do need individuals, businesses to bring these matters forward in a legal court of appeal. And these matters can be appealed based on the laws and the facts. So for example, if there are businesses that do not agree with these restrictions, these laws, they do not agree with these measures, they do have the right to bring them before the courts to test these legal theories or these laws. And it is the job of the judiciary to then interpret these laws and find out whether they are proportionate, whether they are necessary, and whether they were used for a proper purpose. Until we have these legal challenges, then the laws have not been tested themselves. They just stand alone as black ink on a piece of white paper. And of course, they do have jurisdictional authority insofar as premiers, engage their role specifically on these laws. So, think about the context of everything we've been learning about our freedoms, our rights, the principles of the rule of law, principles of natural law, accessing legislation, understanding international human rights precedents. And think of our current context. What kind of questions are you left with? What kind of frustrations or, gaps in the law do you find? So these are things that we need to wrestle with as a community, I believe, and continue asking these questions in an open dialogue. These can only benefit us moving forward.